Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our symposium, Bringing Digitalization Home, How Technology Can Address Housing Challenges. We are very pleased to be able to gather live. We weren't sure. This has been a long period of time. As much as a few weeks ago, there was always questions about what we would be able to do. But we're really pleased to be able to be here in person. We're also very pleased that we can have people streaming online as well. And if you are streaming, please note that if you want closed captioning, if you put your cursor over the window for the video stream, you'll see a CC button that you can click and get closed captioning. And there's a question in the upper right where you can post questions. It will definitely be monitoring those and making sure people watching at home or from your office can get into the Q&A as well. Let me begin by making a land acknowledgement. The Graduate School of Design is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. The school also recognizes the work of the Harvard Native American program in cultivating the relationships that led to the creation of this acknowledgement. Let me just begin by orienting you to this symposium and how it fits within the Joint Center's own mission. I have to acknowledge the contributions of Nick Racinas, who was a director before me, who began this tradition of the Joint Center hosting these symposiums about 2 decades ago. And Nick recognized the opportunity for the Joint Center to use its power of convening to bring together people from the worlds of research, policy, and practice to focus on topics of importance. For many years, those topics were centered around home ownership and affordable rental housing. A few years ago, we did a symposium looking at the issue of integration and residential segregation by race and by income. And so this symposium is a little bit of a departure from us into new territory, but in fact represents the building on work that we've been doing over the last few years. In 2018, we hosted an event, a half-day event, looking at the opportunities for innovation to address our housing affordability challenges. And then in 2019, we brought in the Ivy Prize winners, the top 10 finalists, again, looking at innovations in design, construction, regulation, and finance, and how they can address our challenges. That path led us to this symposium today, which is brought by the contribution from Qualcomm that was directed to us by Barbara Alexander, a long-standing industry fellow of the center. And that gift came with the task to have the Joint Center address how technological innovation can change the housing market. So that was a broad task, and David Luberoff and I worked together to hone that, and we ended up focusing specifically on the issue of technological change as it relates to digitalization, as we saw that this was growing in importance and its effect on so many sectors of the housing market. And so that became the focus of technological change that we focused on. As we dug into it, we identified a number of domains where digitalization was clearly having an impact, including design and construction, regulatory approval processes, housing search and finance, ownership and investment in housing, and how homes are occupied and operated. And in each of these areas, we want our particular interest to be is not just how this is changing how markets operate generally and who can make a profit from these, but specifically whether or not these changes could help or might exacerbate important challenges related to affordability, to segregation, to sustainability, and to the safety and enjoyment of homes. Okay, you might say that that's a bit of an ambitious mandate, and it is. And so I think sometimes it's good to be ambitious, to perhaps bite off more than you can chew, but we hope that the ambitious results in a productive day and a half, that we bring new appreciation and insights into how digitalization is changing housing markets, and importantly, what we can and should do to channel this innovation to improve outcomes, particularly for people of color and lower income households who struggle to obtain good quality, decent, and affordable housing in thriving communities. So with that, my other job now is to express a few thanks. I want to begin by thanking the staff from the GSD and the Communications and Events Department, who have been enormously helpful throughout the process of planning this, including Paige Johnson and Kat Chavez. And I have to give a big shout out to Matt Smith and Brian McArdle, who do amazing work with great skill and patience in presenting the audio-visual component of this with both great skill and patience in what is a really changing dynamic world. I also have to thank many people at the Joint Center who contribute to these events. Our communications team, led by Kerry Donahue and Corinna Anderson. James Chackness, who you'll see everywhere, is our boots on the ground and in the front lines of making sure all the logistics of this event happen and trying to remember how to do this live after having so many years. So a really great big thank you to James for his work, and many, many other people at the Joint Center who you'll meet over the next day and a half. I want to also just acknowledge that the people have been doing this truly excellent work under the stress, strain, and uncertainty of the pandemic. And so the GSD and the Joint Center are grateful to everyone for your great work. And lastly, I owe a particular thanks to David Luberoff, the Center's Deputy Director, who really has been the driving intellectual force in shaping this event over the last 2 years. David dug into this topic with a great deal of energy and zeal, learned a tremendous amount, connected with all of you. And if you're here, it's because of David and his work he did to both track down who's doing great work and convince you to come and join us today. So thank you, David. And now it's my pleasure to introduce David to present our framing paper within Symposium, laying out the scaffolding for the panels and discussions you'll hear over the next day and a half. So with that, David, it's yours.
Thank you, Chris, and I want to echo all of those thanks, and I want to express my thanks to you, both for providing the leadership to provide the opportunity, but also for being the thought partner in this. I probably spent more time on this. I definitely spent more time than you did, but the times, you were very strategic, I think, in where you came in and really helped frame this. You helped connect us with many of the people in this room and many of the people watching. So it really, it's been a team effort. As Chris said, I want to give you a little bit of a scaffolding of how we've come to think about this. When I was walking over, at the risk of putting a cliche out there, I was thinking about, the old famous story about the visually impaired people and the elephant or the elephants. And I've spoken with many of you. I've read an enormous amount, a variety of topics, and I think one of the really interesting things about this symposium is the variety of perspectives, of disciplines within academia, the fact that we've got practitioners, policymakers, people who've been involved in the civic sphere. So what I'm about to present to you is what Chris and I think that elephant looks like, and over the next day and a half, we're going to figure out what you think the elephant looks like, and hopefully we'll have a slightly better version of it as we go along. So I want to do three things. I want to briefly define how we understand digitalization. It's a word that's thrown around a lot, but it's a little hard to figure out sometimes what it means. Discuss just a quick overview of some of the ways it has affected housing and it is affecting housing, and then dig in a little bit, building on what Chris said, to the questions that we're hoping folks will go with. So, we all have this, or some version of this, in our pockets. This is work from Martin Herbert, and what I want you to take away from this is, on the left was a graphic from 2011 in the Washington Post. It's a little hard to read, but he's basically been estimating the amount of data in the world that's in analog form versus the amount of data that's in digital form. And although computers have been around since the 1950s and 1960s, where you see that huge growth in green here, that's roughly 2000. So it's really not until the emergence of the internet and then smartphones and platforms like Facebook and their creative use of APIs, and the emergence of the cloud. And what the effect of that is, that basically Hilbert's estimation is that even as late as 2000, most of the information in the world was still in analog form. And as of about 2008, and certainly by 2010, it's all in digital form. And that, just to remind you of that, we all know that, but I think it's just helpful to underscore that. So what is digitalization as opposed to digitization? And what we've come to think about it as is it's a series of interrelated strategic decisions about all that data that I just showed you. What data to collect? What kinds of new information do you want to create, capture when I visit, Amazon or Facebook or Google Maps? How to organize it? Certainly what to do with it, how to analyze it. Our capacity, by the way, to analyze data has not kept up with the growth over decades of our ability to generate data. So we're getting a little bit better in that, and I think that's one of the interesting changes that's going on. And then really, how's that data used? And the great change of the 2000s, as many of you know, is the recognition that the data itself has enormous value, and so whether and how that data gets monetized turns out to be a really important question, a policy question. Molly Steenson talked last night about the bill that Senators Wyden and Booker introduced. The New York Times today has a really interesting article about a new proposal in Europe about the regulation of data broadly, not specifically related to housing. All of these changes, Victor Meyer-Schonberger and Thomas Ramsey, who I think are some of the more thoughtful writers about these changes, argue, as you can see, a fundamental reconfiguration of the economy as momentous as the Industrial Revolution, this, reinventing capitalism as we know it. Klaus Schwab, the head of the World Economic Forum, has famously called this the fourth Industrial Revolution. So, as we dug into this, one of the really striking things is the narrative, particularly in the financial press, the folks who are doing fintech, which transformed into real estate tech, which transforms into prop tech, which is sort of what it's known in that business. There's this drumbeat that says, this is an industry, housing broadly, that is just ripe for disruption because there's been no digitalization. Computers haven't affected it. And there was this wonderful moment where, I think in an earlier draft of the paper, Chris wrote a comment on the side saying, wait a minute, because if you think about it and walk through, Autodesk and other entities with the creation of CAD and BIM systems, which completely took over the architecture field, actually in the late 80s and early 90s, and continue to this day. There we go. Very similar thing happens with Esri and ArcGIS and all of those other mapping tools. Again, the uptake of these in planning departments around the world is really astonishing. Again, all happening before 2000. The introduction of platforms, Zillow in 2005. Think for a second about just all of the information that Zillow has collected. How many of you have ever gone into a registry of deeds and actually track a fair number of you? You don't have to do that anymore. Zillow's done, and then and that's only one of a number of data points, and then of course all the analytics that Zillow has brought to that, sometimes with success and sometimes, as Mike Delprete will be talking about later, less success. Rocket Mortgage basically didn't exist 20 years ago, is now the largest consumer mortgage lender. And of course, not as visible to the public, but the whole rise of automated underwriting in the 90s and early 2000s. And then of course, the smart home and all of the ways that's changing the way we live. So the narrative that this is a completely hidebound industry, I think, is wrong. That said, it is absolutely obvious that significant change is really underway. The best measure of that, I think, is the fact that in the last 3 years, at least from data from the Center for Real Estate Technology and Innovation, we've seen $90 billion of VC investment broadly in prop tech. Depending on how you want to define it, at least 3/4 of that is in excuse me, is in the housing, is in residential. Mike's going to show you a slightly different number. We think that's because this is international, and he's going to show you a domestic number. As we talked about some last night, the rise of institutional investors buying single-family homes, often using a variety of digitalization-related processes to identify, assess, and make offers on single-family houses, often within hours of them coming on the market. The Washington Post article here estimated that 1 in 7 houses, they were using data from Redfin, in 2021 were bought by an institutional investor, and it was 30% of houses in majority black neighborhoods. That is a huge change. We've seen questions about Wonderful Urban Institute report on automated valuation models in majority black neighborhoods. As we've talked about, just what happens as this goes into credit underwriting, particularly for mortgages. The whole lawsuit involving whether or not Facebook's algorithms led to violations of the Fair Housing Act. So this is a hugely ripe field. So we really want to understand, and I think as Chris said, assess. So we've asked all of the authors and commentators to focus on 3 questions. 1, what's happening? How is this changing a specific aspect of housing? Chris laid out the different sort of broad domains that we're going to examine. 2, so what? Right? How is this going to further or hamper efforts to address a variety of housing-related challenges, be they economic, social, environmental? And 3, given the answers to the first 2, what can we do about that? As policymakers within the private sector, as civic actors, as individuals, to steal a line from Molly Steenson, what's our ethical responsibility here? So Chris has already told you we're going to have over the next day and a half 5 sort of panels focused on specific aspects of housing, and then we're going to end with a panel that Sean Donovan is going to moderate, really kind of trying to bring it back together, saying what does this whole picture look like? Sean is actually going to tell us and his panelists what the elephant really looks like. No pressure, Sean. and as Chris said, we're examining a variety of issues that we think are of concern of housing. If you follow the Joint Center's work, you know that most of these are things that we've been talking about for a long time. The map on the left shows you the share of cost-burdened renters, people paying at least 30% of their income for housing. By metro area, all the red areas are places where over half the renters in that metro are paying more than 30% of their income for rent, and all the dark blue places are people in the 40 to 49% range. A lot of people. And we've kind of added in here, although the center has been interested in equity issues, there are a whole set of, I think, important privacy issues that relate specifically to digitalization, the collection and use of data that we'll be going in and out of over the next 2 days. I think the really big question that we're wrestling with, and we started talking about this last night, is, should we be optimistic, or should we be wary, or should we be both? I used to tell summer fellows in a program I ran that my goal was to turn them either into skeptical optimists or optimistic skeptics. I'm not sure the difference between them, but we want to balance those things. There are some really good reasons to think that this change could help us achieve a variety of outcomes that we really desire. We'll be digging into those. But, and it's a big but, there are reasons to be really cautious. And in particular, as we dug into this, there are sort of 4 areas or 4 kind of broad concerns I think that we're going to wind up talking about, and we started touching on these a little bit last night. The first is essentially is monopoly power. The nature of digitalization and digital platforms is such that it tends to lead to dominant players. At least it has in other entities, and in a sense in real estate, right? Almost everybody who's looking generally for real estate is going to go to Zillow, and because everybody goes to Zillow, that's where you're going to want to be. And so the danger, Fabian Braserman and Andrew Baum, who've written, I think, some of the more thoughtful stuff on these changes, have said that, The question is that the gains may be mostly captured by data monopolists who offer complementary apps and platforms to obtain real estate data for free from the users of those services. Remember, if you're not being sold a product online, you are the product. That's sort of famous aphorism of folks who do this. Second area of concern is, how is this going to be used? Who gets access to these tools and for what purposes? Libby Porter, a geographer, has written, just like all technology, prop tech is not simply a neutral or a platform that just replaces analog system. It has really important implications for power dynamics and how those are going to play out in space in cities. Think back to that Washington Post article. The third is, to what extent might this exacerbate inequality? Ben Green, a young computer scientist who has a marvelous book called The Smart Enough City, says that as private companies increasingly make decisions about individuals based on data drawn from online behavior and social networks, people who are poor or members of marginalized groups can be unfairly excluded from credit, from jobs, housing, and healthcare in ways that circumvent anti-discrimination laws. We really do need to be concerned about this. And then finally, not only in housing, but obviously in lots of other fields, the questions about who has legal access to data, what can they do with it, a little bit of what Ben Green was talking about, and what about hackers? I mean, to the extent that we are making our homes smarter, we are also at some level running the risk of making our homes more vulnerable, and all the illegal things that they might do. So finally, as we thought about this, and again, this is sort of our hypothesis to be tested over the next few days, there are really kind of four, we see central roles here for the public sector. We know historically that policy responses always lag technological innovations. We see an innovation, we begin to understand its social consequences, and if we have a functioning public sector, it begins to step into that breach. That at times feels like a big if. As we looked across how people are responding, and this is really, I think, a charge that we're hoping the panels will dig into, one is to regulate the way the data is analyzed and used. This is the Wyden-Booker proposal. This is very much the European Union proposal that was in the Times today. There's a slightly different approach, which is to focus not so much on the algorithms, but on essentially freeing the data. Meyer Schoenberger and Ramji say that, if you focus on the algorithms, you misjudge the root of the problem, because the network effects of digitalization are always going to lead you to concentration of power. And so they say the mistake is not in the idea of sharing, but what is it being shared. And so there's some interesting proposals out there that as entities become more dominant, to force them to share, make their data more public. You could focus on troubling or at least troublesome outcomes. So think about the disputes about Airbnb. I hope you can read sort of that graphic that was from, it's a picture that was on a lamppost in Montreal, I believe. Lots of cities have grappled with how to regulate Airbnb. Interestingly, I think only one or a handful have actually banned Airbnb. I recall a few years ago, Sheila Dillon, the housing advisor now for 3 different mayors of Boston, said that when Marty Walsh became mayor, they started trying to write Airbnb regulations, and they barely came up with legislation by the time he left. Was it 7 years later? So, and then finally, classic public sector, use incentives to advance your key goals. Tax credits for energy. There are clearly important roles for private and civic actors, particularly if we use incentives. That's really to spur private investment. There is a fascinating surge going on of private investment in green tech, essentially in residential, particularly in residential housing. Greg Smithies, the partner leading those efforts at Fifth Wall, which, as many of you know, has a fairly large fund devoted to this, said, in addition to the ethical normative arguments for decarbonization, I believe it's also smart business. this is a case where I think a lot of people are thinking that they can do well and do good simultaneously. And then finally, civic uses of online tools. Sarah Williams, who will be joining us remotely tomorrow, has notes in her book, Data Action, Using Data for Public Good, that the same data in the hands of different people can produce wildly different outcomes for society, because how people use data shows their vision of the world, and that's what makes our use of data to change the world at once exciting and alarming. You're going to hear about, I think, some really interesting examples of the use of data and these platforms. Sarah Bronin will, I believe in her commentary, will tell you about the work that Desegregate Connecticut and the Connecticut Zoning Atlas is a really, I think, fascinating example of how this might sort of turn the debate on its head. So, reiterating our aspirations, over the next day and a half, I really say I want to we hope we better understand what's happening, and that we have a better assessment of what these changes are likely to produce, and maybe hone a few strategies for how to spur positive change. I am so excited to look forward to these conversations, just want to thank all of you for coming and for contributing to the work of trying to make sense of this enormous elephant. And thank you very much.